Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nyeleti Honwana. I am a program officer at the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Reckoning with Intimate Partner Violence After the Pandemic. This is the second installment of HFG's Global Perspectives on Gender-Based Violence speakers, on our Gender-Based Violence speaker series. I'm incredibly excited to get started as I see sort of people coming in and joining us today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation examines enduring and urgent problems of violence, and we do this through basic and applied research. We aim to understand the causes, manifestation, and control of violence, and we spread this knowledge to inform policy, practice, and public discourse, and to advance scholarship. Drawing from the Foundation's vast pool of scholars and grantees, speakers discuss timely research and analysis of situations of violence, including war, crime, terrorism, intimate relationships, climate instability, and political extremism. As I mentioned, this particular session is the second of 3 such conversations which center gender-based violence in its various forms. And while this conversation will predominantly focus on violence against cis women and girls, there's a plethora of research on how GBV manifests in and impacts the lives of cis men and boys, as well as those in LGBTQIA+ communities. Our hopes is that this informative space really leads to knowledge sharing, and we therefore encourage you, the audience, to pose questions, to offer comments, and share relevant resources in the Zoom chat function. And we'll ask that you actually pose your questions, using the Q&A function to ensure that our speakers get an opportunity to engage with you. So before I get into the program, allow me to briefly run through today's agenda. Our session will begin with a moderated discussion that will take us to the end of the hour. During the conversation, we encourage participants to pose your questions, as I mentioned, using that Q&A function here in the Zoom webinar. And we will also use the chat function to share our speakers' bios and other information during the course of the discussion. Following the moderated discussion, the speakers will have a further 30 minutes to respond and engage with you and answer questions that you pose during the conversation. The discussion, which is being recorded, will be made available on hfg.org. So at this point, I would like to invite the speakers to please turn on their cameras as I briefly introduce them. Great. Hi, Diana. Hi, Lotta. And we're just waiting for Charlotte to join us. Wonderful. So I'll begin with Charlotte. She is a project director at the Regional Institute for Population Studies at the University of Ghana. Her research focuses on gender-based violence and how cultural norms, gendered socialization, and gender inequalities frame the acceptance and use of violence. She also studies women's status and its associations with health and sexual and reproductive health of adolescents. Thanks for joining us, Charlotte. Diana Peel is a criminologist with a PhD from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, and an MPhil from the University of Cambridge. She is based at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda, and her research focuses on gender, coloniality, and state violence. Finally, Lotta Hawink Tenkata is a historian of modern Europe. She is a past and present postdoc fellow at the Institute of Historical Research in London and completed her PhD at Columbia University in New York. Her monograph, In Progress, examines 1970s feminist thought and praxis and the transformation of gendered violence in public perception, social science, and the law, from a private matter to a state concern. So welcome to you all. I'm really excited to have this conversation. And I'd like to start by sort of giving you an opportunity to further introduce yourselves. I'd like you to talk a bit about the regions and the locales where you work, and what are those questions that are really driving your research. So Diana, could I start with you?
Thank you, Nyeleti. So I'm Dr. Diana Peel. I'm a criminologist based in Kampala, Uganda, and my work primarily focuses on sub-Saharan Africa. What drives my research is the desire to understand the role of criminal justice as a system of state control and how that plays out in regards to gender power relations. So my current project, which is funded by the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, thank you, focuses on gender discrimination in sentencing between male and female perpetrated intimate partner homicides in Uganda since 2009, when the mandatory death penalty was abolished. And the research has only just finished. So what my initial results show is that women who kill their intimate partners are treated far more harshly than men who kill theirs. Specifically, women are more likely to receive the death sentence, whereas men are more likely to be convicted of manslaughter. And domestic violence is actually proven to be a mitigating factor in sentencing for male defendants, whereby if there's a history of abuse, this is used to negate the malice aforethought of the defendant. So in layman's terms, that means that if the defendant has beaten up his partner before and she hasn't died, the assumption is he shouldn't know that she would have died this time, and therefore it doesn't meet the threshold for murder, which has been horrifying.
Thank you for that, and for that stark reality. I'd like to invite Charlotte, Charlotte Ofori, if you can turn on your camera and introduce yourself. Wonder if she's having technical difficulties. Perhaps we'll come back to Charlotte. Lotte, please go ahead and introduce yourself. Do let us know the locations where you work and the questions that are driving your research.
All right, thank you so much. So I am Lotte. I'm a historian specialized in Western Europe, and I am currently based in the Netherlands. I'm in Amsterdam at the moment. And my research interests include legal and social history, as well as the history of feminism, gender, and sexuality. And I think at the outset, I want to emphasize that I am a historian. I'm not an expert on current events, although I do follow them very closely, and I frequently contribute to newspapers here about contemporary gender inequity. And I'm very excited to talk to you all today. So my dissertation, as was just mentioned, analyzed how and why gender-based violence was transformed from a private experience into a state concern. And this happened between the late 1960s up until the mid-1980s, when the most radical wing of second-wave feminism in Europe and in the United States launched a truly extraordinarily successful campaign against male violence that led to sweeping legislative reforms, and has also embedded itself into state-funded social provision across Europe. And most broadly, I think my work examines how and why violence behind closed doors has come under the purview of the state as a vacuum to be filled with criminal law. And my work then also participates in a sort of broader spectrum of queries about the erosion of the welfare state in Europe, as well as the use of law and punishment as vehicles for social change. And over the course of the 1980s, this, in a way, very, very visionary radical feminist project, sort of right from initially seeking systemic change, sort of slowly folded itself into the government and into world affairs. And of course, so feminism increasingly focused on these legal reforms that have to date, as we know, not led to the decrease in violence that was expected, right? Because even though European states now have legislated against this violence, it is still shockingly prevalent. So now, sort of coming to the current day, 1 in 3 European women experiences sexual and/or physical violence in their lifetime. And I think very interesting to mention already now is that sort of even in those Northern European states really celebrated as having achieved gender equality, such as Sweden.
Sorry, Lotte, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment. I believe we need someone just to mute themselves here. So let me see if I could get that. Sorry about that interruption. Lotte, please do continue.
All right. Yes, so I was just mentioning that these Northern European states that are really being celebrated as having achieved gender equality, such as Sweden, that actually violence against women there still remains rampant. And academics actually call this the Northern paradox. And of course, sort of coming to the topic of today's discussion, during the COVID-19 lockdowns, all countries in Europe saw an increase in the number of calls to helplines. In France, for instance, a 30% increase was reported. In the UK, 16 women were killed by a male partner between late March and mid-April of 2020, so really in this lockdown. And the increase in women murdered by their partners occurred throughout Europe, and women's shelters have become sort of even more overburdened than they already were. And I think so paradoxically, although we know this and we know that violence is above all inflicted in the private sphere, it is still the public space that continues to be perceived as the most dangerous. So that might be something interesting also to discuss. And another complicating factor still is that most violence is actually not being reported. And we see this also in Western Europe, where actually the sort of legal apparatus is very good at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lotte, for that overview. And I think there, as you were talking, there are a lot of interesting parallels and I think comparisons to be drawn from Diana and Charlotte's work that is very much sort of based contemporaneously on the African continent and some of the realities that COVID brought to bear, right, that were happening the world over, including in Western Europe. Charlotte, now that you've rejoined us, could I invite you to do the same? Please introduce yourself and talk to us a bit about the driving questions of your work.
Great. So I'm Charlotte Ofori. I have a PhD in population studies from the University of Ghana. So basically the driving force for my work is how cultural variables or cultural underpinnings frame the use of violence in intimate unions. And so my PhD basically looked at bride wealth payments, which is quite widespread in sub-Saharan Africa, and how that could necessitate or influence the use of violence against women in intimate unions. What was most interesting about my study was the fact that I relied on accounts of men. So traditionally, we study intimate partner violence by asking women if they've experienced violence. But this time we asked men if they've perpetrated violence and how these cultural variables frame the use of violence. And so my study basically found that the use of violence in intimate unions, looking at cultural variables, is complex and multifaceted, right? And so in cases where you find that when bride wealth is paid fully, men are less likely to be violent compared to when it's not paid at all, right? And that goes against the traditional conversation around bride wealth payment. But it's important to know that that doesn't mean that in intimate unions where bride wealth has been paid, violence does not occur. What we found in our qualitative study shows that violence occurs differently in intimate unions where bride wealth has been paid. And so if the woman refuses to have sex with her partner when bride wealth has been fully paid, for example, she may be more likely to experience violence. People talked about the fact that, well, in intimate unions when bride wealth has been paid, the man can beat the woman just to a certain level and not hurt her. You know, so the results we see in how bride wealth payments frame violence is complex. For women who are in unions where bride wealth has not been paid and where we see more violence, it's usually triggered out of the fact that women want these unions to be legalized and or to be traditionally endorsed. And bride wealth payments endorse unions traditionally. And so when they keep asking their partners, go pay bride wealth, go do the traditional roles, go pay the traditional, you know, do all the traditional underpinnings that you have to do, those could be triggers of conflict within unions, and that could necessitate the use of violence in unions. And so the issue of bride wealth payments is not linear when it comes to its relationship with domestic violence, right? It's more complicated. And I'm fascinated that we don't leave the conversation just there. We begin to talk about how this payment, which is rooted in cultural norms, which doesn't look like it's stopping anytime soon, but how can we manage this particular cultural norm to reduce the incidence of violence as people perceive it to be? Even more alarming is how young people perceive the use of violence when bride wealth has been paid. So my study is finding that constantly young people are more likely to use violence in intimate unions when bride wealth has not been paid, but when they are in cohabiting unions. And this is more alarming because more and more young people are opting for cohabiting unions than marriage, right? And so the issue of bride work payment in cohabiting unions and the use of violence also presents an interesting concept to begin to study or to begin to think about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. And actually, I think what I'd like to do is maybe start the conversation with both you and Diana, right? So maybe we'll stay with you for a moment, because I think some of what you all have started talking about in these brief introductions really is the legislative part, right, of the work that we of the work of countering IPV, right? So both Uganda and Ghana, where each of you have carried out your work, passed legislation in the late 2000s criminalizing intimate partner violence, right? Ghana did so in 2007 and Uganda shortly after in 2010. And so this opened up a space, right, for CSOs, for policymakers and academics to engage with this issue openly. But what we've seen, right, and I think as Lotta alluded to during the pandemic, right, the enforcement of these laws really is lacking in these contexts. And so what do we see? You know, we know that in the African context, we predominantly see IPV prevention that takes a non-judgmental or more community engagement approach, as opposed to one that is centered more on criminal justice and sort of arrest, right, as the treatment for this kind of issue. What do you all see as sort of the alternatives or the middle ground between these two approaches? And maybe Diana, I'll start with you, and Charlotte then come to you. And Diana,
I think it's am I unmuted? Well, yeah, so Uganda passed in 2010 the Domestic Violence Act, which is actually a very progressive piece of legislation. It actually criminalized domestic violence in many forms, including physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, psychological, and economic abuse. It also acknowledged a wider range of contexts in which domestic violence occurs. So it's not just intimate partners, it's actually anyone in the household. And for Uganda or Sub-Saharan Africa, this was relevant because there's domestic help in a lot of households, and they were actually getting protected. And domestic help is actually a very vulnerable population. So this was a big deal. However, the act was actually passed without any budget attached to it. So that really thwarted any ability to implement the act. There have been NGOs in the UN have invested some money in trying to enforce the act, but without a budget, it's been very difficult to actually implement. There's been, no money to create facilities, to train the people who are meant to do the enforcement, to sensitize people. The first stop in the community is usually LC, the local councillor, and they tend to be male, and they tend to be the holders of tradition, shall we say, the people who are most likely to value the cultural norms that, support male privilege. So, the justice system really, it's thwarted at the first step. It's not really an answer that's going to provide any help with it, to remedy the situation. On top of that, you have to factor in the fact that, men tend to be the breadwinners still. Women disproportionately don't have the same economic access that men do. They don't own land. They don't have the same rights in marriage, divorce, inheritance. So they're already at a huge economic disability. And so when you put the man in prison, it is hugely harmful to the women. And if she has children, her children. So, domestic violence within Ugandan context takes place within this larger nexus of social and political inequality. And that is something that ultimately I would like to see addressed. I think, there's no point starting with law reform or looking at community engagement when you can't address the larger situation within which, this gender inequality takes place. So trying to find a way to address women's rights and empower women is a first step, I think, in trying to address some of these challenges that are faced. And also getting a budget for the Domestic Violence Act and actually implementing it also would be a really good start. I'm totally pro that.
Yep, put your money where your mouth is, as they say. Thank you, Diana. Charlotte, please go ahead.
I mean, so I see some intersections between what Diana is saying and what is happening in Ghana. So the Domestic Violence Act was really popular, and there was supposed to be a domestic violence fund. Till now, we know, well, I know nothing. I've tried to Google and find out what's up with the fund. Recently, I heard someone say, like, I think a politician talk about the fact that the fund has no money. There's supposed to be a board. It looks like the board is not really constituted and working properly. And so over time, we are really good at making laws, but implementing them and putting money there to make sure that these boards and legislature are fully implemented becomes a challenge. But in Ghana, also interesting is the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit that's under the Ghana Police Service. And so they are in charge of prosecuting, identifying and prosecuting domestic violence issues. And so they are working, I mean, I think they are in every district and they are doing their best. But of course, there are issues of resources and skilled professionals to deal with these cases. And so for me, I don't think there should be like a divide between community or local perspective and then the government. They definitely have to work hand in hand. For example, I met a queen mother who said that if you bring any rape case to the queen mother's court, she's not going to deal with it. It should go straight to the police station, right? And so queen mothers and chiefs and local leaders are people we can begin to work with, to educate, to serve as advocates for dealing with gender-based violence in Ghana and in Sub-Saharan Africa. And indeed, they are doing so well. The CSOs are doing so well. But how much can they do? It's essentially, they don't have enough resources. They don't have all the skill to be able to do it. And so community and governments must work together to ensure that we get the right results of dealing with gender-based violence in Africa and in Ghana, essentially. Yeah.
And Charlotte, on that point, right, I think one of the questions that we have is a lot of your work really centers sort of the cultural underpinnings, right, that make space for this kind of violence prevalent. In changing those cultural norms, who are those allies? You gave the example, right, of those allies and the stakeholders, right? You gave the example of the Queen Mother. Who else are those community leaders, women themselves or CSOs, right, who are doing work that you've seen that is working in terms of changing cultural norms?
So the first people I'll go to are traditional leaders. So queen mothers, chiefs, even sometimes priestesses, linguists, then units. So we have traditional governance systems, also like the assemblymen and women, because these are people who live in the communities with men and women and children who experience violence, right? And so if we are able to get them to buy into the idea that gender-based violence does not only affect the woman and the child, it affects the man and the society at large, then they fight, right? Then they advocate for gender-based violence. Then they ensure that if someone perpetrates violence, it's not covered up. It's not treated as something within the family, So there is this concept where people are likely to say, well, let's settle it at the family level. Let's not take it to the court. Let's not take it to the police station, right? And so if these leaders are equipped and trained at the basic level, at the community level. And remember that in Sub-Saharan Africa, kinship ties are important. And so if your uncle rapes you, well, you don't want to disgrace the family name, right? You don't want to disgrace your family and your uncle and all that. Kinship ties are important. So till we begin to identify local champions, for me, and then these local champions are able, and if the state institutions are working properly, then these local champions are able to carry these issues to the state. But if local champions are not working, the information is not going to get to the state. Because remember that for the most part, women who experience violence may not be empowered enough to go right to the police station and report these cases, or to go to the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit. They'll go to a local champion, a queen mother, an assemblyman, a unit committee member. So those people who must be empowered to be champions at the local level, not forgetting the state apparatus. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think, I mean, and talking again about the punitive part of this conversation, Diana, I mean, coming to you, your research, I think, is so interesting because it shows it shows not only sort of the ways in which the issue is ignored, or the legislation is not given teeth, if you will, right, in terms of how we actually implement this. But then when we do get to sort of how people are punished, again, we see that differential there between how women and men are sentenced. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're seeing in Uganda around sentencing? How are women being sentenced? How are men being sentenced? And is there any kind of incentive, incentive that we can see from this punitive way in which sentencing is happening, especially towards women, that might actually be a way to de-incentivize, disincentivize IPV more broadly?
Well, I mean, what I found, and sadly, this is something that plays out across time and space, is that women are receiving disproportionately harsher sentences than men. And basically, they're being punished for violating gender norms. Women are meant to be peaceful, they're meant to be domestic, they're meant to be submissive, they're meant to be passive. And when they go against these stereotypes and they commit a crime, especially against their man, their partner, they're punished for it. And this is, you know, something that's been shown in US research and Asian research throughout. You know, this is pretty standard. Cornell University actually came out with a study in 2018 called Judged for More Than Just Her Crime. And they found that 3/4 of women on death row globally are there for killing an intimate partner or a partner. So women do tend to kill their partners more often than, more often than other people. But they're also punished more harshly because it's not what women are expected to do. So this tells us that the criminal justice system, not just in Uganda, is perpetuating these gender stereotypes by sentencing based on gender rather than on offense. And this is a huge problem, especially when women have stories of, he came at me drunk, having just found out he had HIV and tried to rape me, and I struck him and he died, and they're still being sentenced to death. So, you know, I think that the circumstances in which women commit these offenses need to actually be used in sentencing and understood as a mitigating circumstance, rather than you did something a woman's not supposed to do, so you're going to get the harshest sentence possible. Men, meanwhile, you know, she didn't get my dinner ready on time, so I hit her and she died, has come up repeatedly in the cases as a kind of a justification that's been given. Or the other one is, I was drunk, I didn't know what I did. And these are both considered legitimate excuses for killing your partner, for acting in a violent, aggressive manner. And so it's these gender stereotypes. Well, you know, men just generally are more aggressive, and women should fulfill these roles of providing dinner or providing food or providing sex. And if they don't meet those expectations, it's perfectly acceptable, or it's less awful for a man to do these things. Like I said, a history of domestic violence for a man is actually somehow a mitigating factor, that it's not so bad that she died this time, because she didn't die all the other times. He didn't know, even though, you know, we know that domestic violence does tend to escalate to the point of murder. It gets worse each time. So in terms of a deterrent effect on sentencing, that was actually the policy that underlied a lot of criminal justice response in the US, specifically in the 1990s, with mandatory arrest and things like that. It hasn't helped. We find that, I mean, just in general, deterrence is not a great sentencing strategy. It does rely on a rational choice framework, whereby the potential offender is able to make a rational cost-benefit analysis at the time of the crime and decide it's not worth it. There also needs to be a pretty steady criminal justice system where the chance of arrest, prosecution, and punishment are pretty certain and swift, which is not always the case in the African context, or any context, actually. So generally, I think the criminal justice system is not really the solution to gender-based violence. I think by the time a case gets to the criminal justice system, there have been several points of failure along the way, and intimate partner violence actually needs to be addressed far sooner, you know, at the family or community level, before it gets to the point where the criminal justice system is getting involved. I think health facilitators are probably the first point of call before the criminal justice system, where a woman is, or a victim is, going to actually come into contact with a system outside of the family or outside of the community. And I think that is probably, certainly in the Ugandan context, the first obvious point where an intervention can be made and should be made, rather than waiting till it gets to the criminal justice system.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to turn now, Lotte, I'd like to bring you into the conversation because as they were both speaking, I saw you sort of nodding your head. And I would like to sort of take a step back, right? And if you would talk a little bit more about the major drivers that we saw that transformed IPV from this private experience, right, to something that was that necessitated a state level response, especially with the backdrop of the conversation we've had thus far that puts forth this idea that there are these macro level and sort of intersectional issues that really lead us to IPV. But it has to do with economics, it has to do with health, it has to do with gender stereotypes and entrenched gender norms. And that's something that we see globally. So talk to us a little bit about how that transition happened, and specifically about the sort of the feminist gender-based violence paradigm that helped to make that shift come about.
Yes, thank you. And I just wanted to add to Diana, that what was really fascinating also is that, of course, we know here in Europe that it's actually at the moment when a woman decides to leave her partner is when she's actually most at risk, which I imagine is a global occurrence. But that also underscores, these kind of gender norms, like it's, I would say that it's this is also as big as a problem here as it is anywhere else. I think in terms of how IPV was transformed from this private experience into an ill necessitating this kind of state level response is that what is really fundamental in terms of the feminist history of this is that in the late 1960s, women began sort of coming together in these consciousness raising groups where they were sort of discussing their private lives. And as they were talking to one another, they realized that their experiences, in fact, were not sort of personal or individual, but were in fact structural problems. And so in response to that, the first shelter was opened in the UK, actually. Dutch and German women visited this shelter, and then kind of modeling after this UK example, all over Europe, shelters were opened. So this is all in the early 1970s. And these shelters actually immediately overflowed, which of course actually proved their point, that this was a huge problem. So more and more women were beginning to leave their partners and moved with their children to these shelters. And something I think that's important to emphasize is that these shelters really actually did much more than sort of just offering shelter. They actively lobbied with the government, with the local police, and with the welfare states in Western Europe being particularly strong at this time. More and more money actually began to be spent on these shelters, as well as on more general emancipation policies. And I think another sort of important event here is that at the same time, actually more and more women went into academia, and in a way, feminism sort of gained institutional power. And so these feminists that were increasingly working in the social sciences, they were actually the first to conduct really large-scale research projects, mostly in the 1980s. And these research projects were actually, of course, proving how much violence was actually occurring, and also the sort of really devastating effects that this violence had, and the long-term sort of traumatic consequences as well. And these very first statistics, which were really wild, like the ones here in the Netherlands in the 1980s, for example, looking at sexual abuse within the family, were really shocking when they first came out. And in a way, this sort of, this also, as more feminists kind of went into national politics, they were able to then, in a way, like drive this issue sort of upwards to the state level. And then, of course, we could discuss whether, like, what the effects of this then have been for it to kind of grow to this ever higher up state level, which might in daily life actually just not have affected the changes I think that women in the 70s were really hoping that it might.
Thank you for that overview. And after having this conversation and thinking about sort of where we're moving to within the conversation around responses to IPV and broadening definitions, there's an interesting point that I think we could unpack a little bit about the ways in which the feminist movement that really gave us the framework, right, and the blueprint for how we think about these issues, at least in Western Europe, and I think the Western world more broadly. How has that shifted now as we're moving towards a sort of gender neutral thinking, right, around violence and the various ways in which it impacts not only women and cisgendered women, but broader, the broader LGBTQI community? What does that do in terms of accountability, especially as we understand that men continue to be, right, it's the word I'm looking for, the majority of perpetrators? How has that complicated the landscape, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to just see the sort of terminology evolve over the years, right? Where it's like violence against women in the 1970s. Some might have said male violence against women, right? I think even in the term sort of violence against women, men are actually not mentioned. And then, of course, there's this sort of transition to increasingly gender neutralizing violence, kind of as our understanding of gender has, I think, very rightfully changed. But one sort of aspect that has become more complicated is that whereas sort of these feminist researchers that I just mentioned, whereas in the 1980s, they were really after data and just really being able to say, like, this is how many men, this is how many women. And with the sort of gender neutralizing of these terms, and I think an important term to mention there is domestic violence, which sort of has no gender attached to it at all, and which has also here in Holland has really become the sort of main term that we use, is in a way just sort of, it threatens to cover up this very, in a way, uneasy reality that you, I think, rightfully mentioned, which is that it is still predominantly male violence against women that we see. And at the same time, of course, we should involve, I think, in that discussion, gender-based violence that is not only about cis women, obviously, at all. Yeah.
And I think, circling back to COVID, how did COVID particularly sort of impact this? Were we seeing, the kinds of rates that we were seeing during COVID? I think both in the context that you're in, Lotte, but also sort of globally, right? What questions does this leave for researchers who are interested in unpacking, right, the rates of IPV, our understandings of IPV, and the underpinnings of IPV? I think what I'm getting to is what broader structural questions can researchers who are squarely in gender studies ask? What kind of intersectionality do we need to potentially see amongst researchers in various disciplines to get a better understanding, right, of those structural issues that are really shaping IPV?
Mm-hmm. I think, right, we have definitely seen this sort of really marked increase in violence during the lockdowns, when, of course, kind of with people just literally not being able to leave the house, like, right, this sort of atmosphere was very tense. So we have definitely seen this very direct impact of the lockdowns in that sense. But I would also maybe encourage everyone to also think about whether this sort of current crisis isn't about much more than COVID, right? Because in a way, at the moment, I think sort of globally, we seem to be in a really unprecedented kind of polycrisis, as some academics have started to call it. There is increasingly, there's greater wealth inequality. Also within Europe, there is greater insecurity. The effects of the climate crisis are becoming more apparent. There's a rise of extreme right-wing politics in Europe, including in my own country at the moment. So there are kind of crises happening at various levels, and at the same time, women are faring better than men in Europe at many levels, including education and mental health. For example, suicide rates are much higher among men than they are among women. So there is also a sort of question of whether we are facing some kind of backlash with women in a way having gained so much in the public sphere over the past few decades. And I would say, like, right, I'm sure with many of you also based in the United States, we might also actually raise the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the overturning of affirmative action, right? Could we even discuss this without also mentioning that really major gains of second wave feminism are just being eroded in the United States at the moment?
Absolutely. And thank you for that, because I think it's important to sort of bring in, right, the other parts, or bring the totality of the narrative, right, the totality of the story here. And given the sort of erosion and sort of the backsliding that we seem to be seeing, what does that mean? And I'd like to come to you, Diana. What lessons do you think can be drawn, right, between the ways in which we're trying to counter the same issue, right, on the African continent, right, where you and Charlotte are working, and the type of erosion that we're seeing farther afield? What lessons and what kind of connections do you think can be drawn between these two contexts?
Well, I think a lot of the interventions that are being championed now for sub-Saharan Africa, certainly Uganda, remind me a lot of the feminist movements in the 70s and 80s in the US and Canada, actually, specifically, which saw legal reform and legislation to increase services for domestic violence survivors, criminalize marital rape, things like that, things that feminists saw as a way to actually help domestic violence survivors. But ultimately, these haven't actually reduced violence against women. The rates have not gone down. I think it's very important to also note that what works in like global North context cannot just be transplanted to the global South. I think it's so important to be culturally aware of this specific scenario and not just bring in legislation that may or may not have worked in the US and Canada. I think it's very important that it's specific to the country, region, culture within which it's taking place. But we're still seeing, regardless, we're still seeing those kind of legislations and reforms being advocated here. They didn't work in North America. I doubt they're really going to work here. So I think it's important to actually, start from scratch and see, okay, given the cultural context, given the history, given the specific structures and inequality that exist within an African context, what is going to work? How can we address these that is relevant and specific to the culture and the contents and the location where we're acting in?
Absolutely. And I see there's a number of questions coming in from our audience. And so it's great that we have such an engaged audience. Before we go to those questions, and please do feel free to use the Q&A or the chat function. I see questions coming in both. I'd like to ask one more question of you, Charlotte, given this, what Lotte, what Diana have been talking about. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of being context specific, right? Talk to us about the terminology that is used, how it's resonating, right, in local context. And I think also, one of the sort of policy-making apparatuses that apparati that I always think is important to bring in, right, is the international agenda setting, right? You look at something like, the Sustainable Development Goals and where women and gender sit, right, within that conversation. I think there there's often a disconnect, right, between the agenda setting that happens at the international level and the local realities, as Diana and as Lotte have been talking about. Charlotte, can you speak more about that, about where you see disconnects and what you see is actually working, right? What are examples of success that we can tout, if you will, that come specifically from an African context, right, from the context of Ghana, where you are?
Yeah, thank you. So I see similarities in all that they've been saying, and so you see that even though some of these experiences are shared even across contexts, context still is important, right? And so some of the things that may be relevant in Ghana may not be relevant in the UK or in Uganda for that matter. For example, in marital unions in Ghana, the marital rape is not totally criminalized, right? The Criminal Offences Act of 1960 actually kind of criminalizes it, but the Domestic Violence Act of 2007 is not explicit on what, marital rape, how it should be dealt with. And so you see that, are we going forward or are we going backwards? Even if the Criminal Act of 1960 somewhat criminalizes marital rape, then what happened in 2007? Why was it not explicitly stated that it's a crime? So you see that it's important that some of the achievements we are making, we solidify these achievements, right? And so we have to look at the context in which these laws are being made. We have to look at those who are making the laws and who are these laws affecting, essentially. Again, if our courts and judicial systems are popularized by men, and if institutions are patriarchal, then some of these things will be more difficult to advance, right? Criminalizing marital rape, for example, will be difficult to advance. Another issue that comes to mind when we talk about context is even the way we define domestic violence, right? And the way we define how, if someone is hit or bitten due to one thing or the other that he or she does, how is that considered as abuse, right? And so in some of the work I've done, someone will say, oh, you only hit her a little and you didn't hit her. That's not abuse. I mean, she didn't die. She didn't get a cut, So people conceptualize abuse in that way. And so it's important that we understand how people understand violence. As long as a husband didn't hit her to the point that she was in the hospital, then maybe it's not, you can live with that. And so the context in which the violence is taking place, even within one society, it's important that we understand. It's important that even women who are experiencing this violence understand that if someone hits you, and even if you don't get hit, that form of hitting is abuse. So even if the woman doesn't know that form of hitting is abuse, she's less likely to report it or stop someone from being hit in that manner. So the context in which we define abuse and violence is important. And that's what should be carried in the conversation in Sub-Saharan Africa. Otherwise, we miss out on all these nuances or all these acts of violence that women and children and men are experiencing.
And just before I let you go, Charlotte, do you have any examples to share of when that's happened, right? CSOs that you know of, or groups that you know of, when they rightfully identify, right, how that's happening, and what are some of the ways in which they're trying to counter, right, those kinds of occurrences?
Great. So there have been, like, the ACT Foundation, for example, has been talking a lot about, so there's this thing about witchcraft, the witchcraft law, where older women are identified as witches and they are more likely to be abused. A few years ago, one old elderly woman was stoned to death, for example, because she was identified as a witch in Ghana, right, in a community. So the ACT Foundation, the Pearl Safe Haven, the Dream On Foundation, they've spearheaded some of these conversations. And so you see CSOs really spearheading this conversation and ensuring that the laws and the acts that pertain to these actions are dealt with. Recently, the Speaker of Parliament was talking about the criminalizing the witch hunting and witchcraft laws in Ghana, right? And so we see not only CSOs, but we see ministers of state, we see the Speaker of Parliament and parliamentarians who are advocating for some of these things. And that's a good way to go when we come to handling and criminalizing these things. Yeah. And then another, yeah, just to add on, and so here when COVID was all over the place, and where we cannot, I mean, there's this two-sided parts of the coin where we are saying that the numbers we are seeing in the increase in COVID-19, was it because of all the noise that was being made that people were reporting more, or was it that, yes, COVID-19 actually increased the rates of violence? But the UNFPA with the Ministry of Women and Children Protection, for example, created this website and that encouraged women to report and call and gave legal aid and provided shelters, right? And so all these things are being done to support women who experience violence and throw more light on issues of domestic violence in Ghana.
Thank you, Charlotte. And I think, I mean, in keeping with the theme, right, of this conversation, it's interesting to see the gains that happened, right, after what was called the shadow pandemic, right, the rates of domestic violence and intimate partner violence specifically during and post COVID-19. I'm looking at the time, and I do want to make sure that we get to as many questions as possible coming in from our participants, our audience here today. So let me go ahead and start. There's an interesting question, actually. This is raised by Doyinsola Gunbiade around the stigma of rape. And I think this gets to, you know, differences between the types of violence that we see. Doyinsola's question or comment rather is around how rape cases can be contentious in various African contexts because of the stigma attached to it. And there's a major area, this is a major area that could be examined, right, by researchers to better understand how do we, actually, and I'm adding to Doyinsola's question here, but how do we, you know, sort of attack the various ways in which different types of violence are understood and the reactions to it. Diana, maybe I'll put that question to you, but then Lotta or Charlotte, if you'd like to jump in on that, please feel free.
Yeah, actually, that question, part of my research involved interviewing women who'd been sentenced to death for killing an intimate partner. And one of the women I'd interviewed, she was raped at the age of 13. And her mother was going to go to the police, but then the neighbors said, well, everybody's just going to blame you for this. So she actually forced her 13-year-old daughter to marry the 30-year-old rapist, which, as you can imagine, was not a happy union and resulted in her eventually killing him in self-defense, but she was charged with capital murder. So yeah, I mean, rape is one of the largest problems with, I mean, and not even in Uganda, I mean, globally, there's obviously a huge stigma around rape. We know it's one of the least reported crimes. We know that there's a huge problem of victim blaming, you know, in whatever way it is. And unfortunately, yes, women's sexual and reproductive health in Uganda is still, you know, abortion is still illegal, for example. There's not much access to birth control. There's still a lot of state control around women's sexuality like that. So yeah, there's an awful lot of stigma. And sorry, Nyeleti, can you repeat the question?
No, I think you've answered it really with that example that you've offered, right? I think there is a way in which, and I think this is something that maybe is key, right, to helping us understand the contextual differences, but these differences that we see, I think, you know, without going, you know, without being overly political, I think we started to see the breakdown of what we classify, what we define as, you know, as assault, as violence, as, you know, requiring a particular kind of punishment, right? There was really a broad conversation as to the degrees of bad, if you will, depending on what it is that you're dealing with. And I think rape, as Doyinsola rightly points out, the world over, as you've said, but specifically in Africa, can lead to, rather than heralding it as the ill that it is, a way to sort of quiet this or hush it up, if you will, is marriage, right? To sort of make I'm from Mozambique, and we have a saying in Portuguese in Mozambique when it comes to things like this, right, within the family. You want to make the picture pretty. That's that's sort of the translation, if you will, into English. And I think that is something that it's the overriding factor. It's how are you going to be seen within the community. I'd like to make sure that I get to some more questions. So Lotte, yes, if you'd like to jump in on this answer, and then I'll move on to the next question.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I just wanted to add, right, that also in Europe, that criminalizing marital rape was really this sort of final step in the whole legal process. It was by far like the most difficult to convince people that it was really necessary. And I mean, it just so sort of doesn't correspond with maybe how we would like to see the world, right? That this, and also that in terms of rape, that it's still, women are still at the highest risk with men that they actually know. And I think it's also interesting because it really overturns this actually often very racist notion of rape being a danger that is sort of outside and in the streets and sort of the man waiting in the dark. And that really, I mean, numbers have shown over decades that that just isn't reality.
Absolutely, absolutely. There are a fair few questions that have come in around solutions. I'd like to start with Alison Cordoba's question here about the mechanisms through which local communities can meaningfully engage and collaborate with government agencies. I leave this question open to each of you who would like to sort of take this, but I think that's something that we can delve a little more into, right? How are local communities engaging with government agencies in meaningful ways? So Charlotte, should I start with you?
Yeah, I can start that. So I think that it essentially starts from how we begin to criminalize the use of violence in our communities, right? And so as I indicated before, in Ghana, it's been, I mean, the traditional council and all that, they know that when you bring rape cases to the traditional courts, they are not supposed to be dealt with. Rape cases are supposed to go to the police station, right? When you take rape cases to the traditional courts, what happens is that they are settled traditionally, right? And so, then you compensate the lady or the woman who was raped, and then maybe the issue goes away, right? But when you take it to the police station, then it's criminalized, right? And so traditional leaders are being sensitized to know that rape cases should not be dealt traditionally or within the community. They are supposed to be criminalized. And so they go to the police station. And so when we begin to create awareness of what these issues are, traditional leaders and local communities begin to pick them up. So that's why the Queen Mother will tell me that you cannot bring a rape case to my court. I won't deal with it. I won't deal with it in my traditional court. The same applies to female genital mutilation, for example. If we begin to criminalize it, and we are actually following it through, people will not even send it to traditional courts to be dealt with. They go straight to the police station and then to the circuit courts. So it's important that we identify what the act of violence is, how community members understand and buy into their ideas, and how traditional leaders pick up these differences and move with them. That's the only way, I think, some of the ways we can begin to engage community traditional leaders more effectively.
Thanks, Charlotte. Diana, Lotte, would you like to jump in on this question? No? Great. If not, I'll move to the next one. I think we'll stay with solutions here. There's a great question around someone being curious if you all have heard of successful interventions against IPV that use tech and AI in particular. Lotte, Diane, maybe I'll go to one of you if you've heard, of any useful interventions, successful interventions. Diana, maybe I'll start with you.
So I mean, actually, no. And I mean, one of the big problems with that is women don't have access to that kind of technology. Specifically in the rural areas, they might not even have access to phones. They haven't received much formal education, if any education. So I think many women who are sort of predisposed to be victims of domestic violence or are victims of domestic violence also tend to be less educated, have less access to technology, are not literate. So, I mean, while it would be awesome to have some kind of tech intervention, unfortunately, the women are disadvantaged in that they would not be able to take advantage of that. So, yeah, that would be a big problem I would see in Uganda. So it doesn't answer the question, but no, I don't know of any successful tech intervention, unfortunately.
Well, actually, before I go to Lotte, I'd like to stay on that point with you, Diana, because I think what we see, right, there is I think definitely when you get into AI, right, and other types of perhaps more high tech, I think there's definitely a problem of access. But in terms of, and especially in the urban centers across the continent, there is and I don't want to butcher this, my colleagues in tech would laugh at me, but sort of the access to the soft internet, if you will, right? I mean, the fact that there's this prevalence of young people with phones, with WhatsApp, who are communicating online, or what they call the soft internet, right? It's not they're not connected to the web, if you will, but they are connected via social media. Have you seen any examples of those kinds of connections being useful and providing successful interventions for IPV?
Sadly not. And school age girls, specifically teenagers, I know disproportionately suffer a lot from specifically sexual violence. And I would imagine they would be the age group that would benefit most from this sort of soft internet, but I'm not aware of any successful intervention, unfortunately. But I think that would be something that NGOs could actually look into utilizing and making the most of. I think actually social media could be a great way to expose potential victims to the fact you don't have to stay. There are options. You do have access. These are your rights. This could be a way to get message out to victims and survivors. But I haven't unfortunately heard of it happening.
Thanks, Diana. I think definitely in terms of new areas for research and new questions, and I'm sure there are people in the audience that may have these examples. I think what we saw, I wrote a paper, or I co-wrote a paper about sort of the ways in which the soft internet and WhatsApp specifically were being used to counter misinformation and disinformation about COVID itself, right, across the African continent. And so I think absolutely you're right. There are ways in which we could use the tech that does exist, that is prevalent, also in terms of countering violence that we see. Charlotte and Lotte, if you've got nothing to add on this point, then Lotte, would you please do jump in?
Sure, yes.
Yeah. So that. Oh.
Should I go first? Yeah. Okay. I was just going to add. I mean it seems really important in order to spread information. It's actually making me think of these shelters that I mentioned. They actually advertised in newspapers. So just a sort of previous kind of way to disseminate information. And actually one thing that they did was that when women were being killed by their husbands, they would actually announce that in the newspapers as a way of just like spreading the facts in a way. So it's just making me think of that. And I think in terms of tech being used as a solution, I also haven't heard like successful stories. I think what it's making me think of is that in Europe, where sort of with the European Union kind of moving forward to criminalize all sex without consent, right? There is discussion here of using apps on phones to sort of give consent prior to having sex. But I think that is already like very then kind of raising all of these other issues that I think feminists are like rightfully critiquing, like under what circumstances would someone feel safe enough to say yes or no, like what other sort of power factors come into play. So it seems to sort of, I mean, it's a very like clean solution, but I think we could already come up with a lot of potential problems using that.
Yeah. So I've heard about this software recently, but I never followed the app. Maybe I should one of these days, by UNICEF and then Microsoft. It's called the Primarox. So it's a software for reporting, identifying violence. But so I think they are trying to launch it in Ghana, and they are hoping that it will go worldwide. And that's the only software I've heard. I don't know how successful it has been over time, but it's interesting that UNICEF and Microsoft are spearheading some of these things.
Thank you. Thanks for that example. And as we're talking, I see there's so many people in the chat here that have some examples for us, that are sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. And I do ask that you'll get in touch with the foundation, get in touch with us, and let us know what examples are happening, because we will put all of this information on the page where this video will eventually live on our website. So thank you for your ongoing engagement. Let's go back to some of the questions we've got here. There are a couple of questions that have come in around violence against men, actually. And there's one question here from Valentina Baranowski. I hope I'm saying that correctly, which is for you, Diana. She references, or they reference, a piece that you wrote for Oxford on domestic violence and the death penalty in Uganda. And so the question is, given all of your research on the subject, what do you think should happen to women who kill their partners?
That's a great question. I think it's important to take it on a case-by-case basis. Even amongst some of the women I interviewed, I mean, one of them did do it in a bit more of a cold-blooded situation rather than a self-defense. So I think it's important to understand the different degrees of murder. There's a huge difference between someone who kills their partner in self-defense and someone who's made the decision they've had enough and then planned it. In about half the cases we found on the court records research, it was not a woman acting alone. She actually had a male partner, not intimate partner, but sometimes, but they'd actually got someone else in to help commit the murder, which showed a malice aforethought, to use the Ugandan legal term. They'd actually planned it. Even though the man had been abusive, they'd actually taken those steps to make plans to kill him. So I think if there's evidence of domestic violence, and I would say that I think it's important that the court and the lawyers, court personnel, the lawyers and the judges, are actually sensitized to what domestic violence is. One of the really great things about the Domestic Violence Act, it understood that there was domestic violence, not just physical or sexual. Economic abuse is also domestic violence, for example. So understanding these different levels, if you make sure your wife has absolutely no money and she ends up killing you, she's still a victim of domestic violence, even if you never hit her. You still controlled her to a point where she had no access and had no ability to maintain any kind of self independence. So understanding what domestic violence is and using that as a mitigating circumstance in sentencing. When you've committed murder, unless you can prove that it is in self-defense, which is when there's an imminent threat, you've still taken someone's life. That's still a very serious crime, even though murder tends to have a very low recidivism rate. You've still taken someone's life. So it should be considered in mitigating the sentence rather than in forgiving the crime.
Yes. Thank you for that. There's another question that we have here, and I'll read it. I'll read it rather than trying to summarize it here, so I make sure that I get it correctly. This is a question around whether there are countries in the world in which we've learned something new about the relationship between annualized measures of the prevalence of GBV and the most measured efforts to reduce it, including new legislation against discrimination, the incidence of FGM, for instance, workplace equity, political representation, or access to reproductive rights and health. Let me put that to you, Diana, and maybe we'll come to you, Lotte, and then Charlotte.
That is a good question. I mean, I know there's a lot of research that's been done in the global north, specifically in Europe and the US. I wouldn't feel very comfortable talking about that when we're talking about the global south. I think a very important part of the research that we do is understanding that stuff that happens in Uganda is culturally specific to Uganda. So there is a lot of research in countries outside of Uganda, which maybe is beyond the scope of this discussion. But within Uganda, I mean, it's really police reports, and police reports only really started to include that from 2011 after the passage of the Domestic Violence Act. You know, it's obviously a very unreported crime, and reports have gone up about tenfold since then, which I don't think means that crime has gone up tenfold. It's just reporting has gone up tenfold. But what is interesting about the Ugandan police reports is that they actually define domestic violence homicides when they're listing cause of homicide. You know, it's mob action, poison, shooting, domestic violence. I assume they base it upon, you know, an intimate partner has killed, or husband has killed his wife, or wife has killed her husband. But they actually define it as a cause of death. But those tend to be the main measures, and not much more has been done looking at, I mean, even the impact of the Domestic Violence Act. You know, there's very little research on how these interventions are played out, unfortunately.
Thank you. Lotta, have you seen anything on your side of the proverbial pond, if you will, of this kind of research?
Thank you. Could you maybe sort of repeat what kind of research exactly you are talking about?
So it's the relationship. Yes, absolutely. And I'll read it here. It's the relationship between measures. Oh, I think we've lost Charlotte there for a moment. Of the prevalence of GBV and most measured efforts to reduce it, right? So anything around legislation against discrimination, workplace equity, political representation, or access to reproductive rights and health. Right? Are there countries in which we've learned something new about these relationships as it relates to IPV?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, which is limited on this particular question, right, is that here we know that, and it's kind of alluding also to something that I think Diana has mentioned, but is that actually economic independence is really a sort of driving factor in this violence decreasing, or women at a much earlier point in a way being able to already get out and thereby sort of circumventing the legal system. So that would be my answer to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Lotta. I think we've got time for a couple more questions here. There's one question that's coming, I think, apropos of the conversation that we started having around sort of the economic and financial realities, right, of domestic violence, that comes from Pamela Manya. And she says, you know, there's a direct connection between financial ability, right, of the abused, mostly again, women and girls, and IPV. And so what are are there any economic interventions that are in place to help with that? Diana, maybe I'll come to you, and then Lotta, if you've got examples, and then we might go to Charlotte. So Diana, please.
So there was a spate of cases in 2016 and 2017 of economically well-off women, you know, sort of upper middle class, you know, had their own car, had, you know, nice houses, who were killing their husbands. There was a very famous case, Jackie Honwana, who ran over her husband when he came to open the gate, and then I think backed up over him again. You know, and these were women who suffered domestic violence. They, you know, they were economically independent, sorry. They did have their own wealth, but there were other things keeping them in these relationships where, you know, they ended up murdering their partner rather than actually leaving, which would have thought, you know. So I think there's other aspects at play, you know, that actually kept them in these relationships. So it's not just, I mean, within Uganda, intimate partner violence is not just something that happens to the poor or the uneducated or the economically disadvantaged. It cuts across socioeconomic status, tribe, you know, area of the country. I mean, it seems to impact women throughout the country. And economic independence doesn't really seem to be a guarantee that you're not going to be a victim, to the point where your only way out feels to be to murder your husband.
Thanks, Diana. And Charlotte, I'll come to you with the same question. Are there any economic interventions that are in place to help women that you're aware of in Ghana?
No, I won't say specific interventions to help women, like, but what I know is that basically the CSOs and NGOs try to economically empower these women when they move out from abusive unions and all that. But I would say they are like strategic economic empowerment strategies tailored towards empowering men to escape domestic violence, right? But government is constantly putting in strategies to empower women here and there, increasing access to education, sexual reproductive health services. I mean, all those things in the long run, I mean, may influence women's empowerment, give them access to paid jobs and all that. But these things have long-term consequences and have good positive effects on women's empowerment and well-being generally here.
Thanks, Charlotte. Oh, I'm hearing myself again. There's an interesting question that's come in around the role of churches, and I think probably more broadly the role of religion. So the question is around considering that religion, that divorce is not approved of in various in some religions, right, across the continent. I'll put this question, Charlotte and Diana, to you both, which in turn leads women to remain in these marriages despite their violence. How are ways in which we can, deal with the institutions, religious institutions, with the church as a particular site for condoning violence? What have you seen? What have been your experiences, right, as you've carried out your research with the role of the church? This is something just to sort of put a finer point on it, that came up in our previous conversation around GBV and in conflict situations, in which the church was also really a major, and religion was a major factor in the kinds of violence that we saw perpetrated against women in conflict situations. So Charlotte, Diana, I can put it to either one of you if you'd like to take on this question about the role of religion, the role of the church as a site.
Yeah, so I actually found that the church didn't really have much impact at all. Co-wives is a big thing. Sort of polygamy, it's not official, but polygamy is a thing if you pay bride price to the second woman's family. So in a lot of the women I interviewed for part of my research, there was an issue of a co-wife. The man had taken on another woman and paid bride price for her, which obviously is absolutely not okay in the church. And Uganda is 65% Catholic. It's predominantly a Christian country. But these cultural norms remain where, yeah, it's okay to have more than one wife if you're able to, provide for them. So I didn't see religion actually playing a big part, especially when you have, this polygamous setup. I think it potentially actually could have provided a source of support for women. And I know the church certainly, in the larger scale, plays a role in, preventing abortion being legal, for example. But within domestic violence, it doesn't seem to actually, in Uganda at least, play any role, whether protective or aggravating.
Thanks. And one of the things that I was going to raise just around this particular question, it's unfortunate, I think Charlotte might be having some trouble with her connection here, but I think in the example that she gave, in which young people in Ghana are moving towards cohabitating as opposed to marriage, and the ways in which that's complicating bride wealth and bride wealth payments, it would be incredibly interesting to see what, to understand sort of what are the ramifications for religion in those kinds of cohabitating arrangements. We understand that actually leads to more violence against the women many times in those relationships. But what does that mean in terms of the relationship to the church and religion, in which young people are actually moving away from marriage, right? So hopefully Charlotte will be back and she can answer that question. We have time, I think, for one more question here. And so I'd like to make sure that we've got one here that I'm just seeing. So this one is around terminology, and this is another one that I'll read verbatim. This question, they would like to know if we adopt gender-based violence is it a term that excludes other women? So I think this is about that broadening, right, of the terminology. When we talk about GBV, the majority of cases that stand out are cases of cisgendered women. And the question is wondering about sort of the invisibility of other women, especially trans women, who also suffer in these societies, in our societies broadly, that are not reported on as much. I think there's an interesting way in which we can complicate that, especially given the African context that both Diana, you and Charlotte are working in. But Lotta, maybe I'll come to you with this question, right? How do we deal with the potential invisibility of other women as we try and figure out or unpack IPV and domestic violence?
Sure. I mean, I think it's such an important question. It is a very sort of complicated one. I also feel, I mean, even in my own work, right, as a historian, it's sort of tempting to kind of go along with the terminology that my historical subjects are using. And so I also find that this is really actually violence against trans women specifically here is something that I find that I actually need to pay more attention to than I have been up until this point. I actually sort of only last week, very recently, heard about the number of trans women that have already here in the Netherlands been killed this year, and it's really it's like at least over 100, and I was really shocked by it. So it's very I mean, clearly it's such a serious issue, but yeah, I actually, in a way, I want to sort of just take your question also like as a challenge in work going forward, that I just feel it's something that needs to be addressed much more. Thank you.
Thanks, Lotta. Charlotte, can I invite you to offer your thoughts on this question?
Can you ask the question again? I was lost a bit by the internet.
Oh, not a problem. So this question is around terminology and sort of broadening the scope of our current conversation, right? About the invisibility of other kinds of women when we're thinking about how we tackle IPV, right? The invisibility of non-cisgendered women, like trans women and others who are also suffering, but also are suffering from the invisibility of underreporting, right? In terms of the violence that they face. I know that it's a more complicated question in some of the contexts in where you and Diana are working, but have you come across conversations around this? What does your research show, right, about the other types of violence or other women who are suffering from similar types of violence, whether in domestic cases or beyond, right, in terms of their partner relationships?
And so, yes, I'm happy you indicated that context matters, right? And so for other women, trans women and other women, it's in Ghana, it's almost like it's criminalized. And there's a bill almost before the House where LGBTQ and moving forward may be criminalized, right? And so I think even for I've not read so much about domestic violence or violence against these women, right? But I think that even the fear of being identifying as LGBTQ and being criminalized may prevent these women from reporting. And so they may be experiencing this violence and they may be less likely to report. So even maybe within their domestic settings, they may not experience violence, but in their workplaces, outside their family, they may be more likely to experience violence. And that's I don't have so much knowledge on what is happening in Ghana, but I will not be surprised that they are experiencing violence in different forms, because violence cuts across people, high income earning, low income earning, educated, non-educated, LGBTQ, non-LGBTQ. People experience violence irrespective of where they stand. Yeah.
Thank you, Charlotte. And Diana, I'll come to you because, as we know, I mean, Uganda's sort of infamously, signed a lot of really repressive anti-LGBTQI laws. What has been your experience, right, of the invisibility of the violence that people within these communities have suffered?
I mean, it's invisible. I mean, they are criminalized purely because of their identity. So I am aware of some research about 10 years ago on same-sex sex workers. But to my knowledge, nothing has been done recently. I mean, it would put a lot of people at risk to even, yeah, it's not a friendly environment to the LGBTQI+ community. And I honestly, as far as I would imagine, they have absolutely no resource, legal community-wise, in order to address domestic violence or gender-based violence. So I would imagine it's like other countries where they disproportionately suffer a lot of abuse, both within, in relationships and in the community. But it's just, yeah, it's completely invisible because of the draconian laws that have been passed. And to report any abuse would put themselves at risk of, being arrested and tried and prosecuted just for their identity. So yeah, it's I mean, they're suffering a lot from, state gender-based violence at the moment, which prevents them being able to report or seek redress from any other forms of violence that they experience outside the state.
Thank you. So with that, I am now tasked with bringing this conversation to a close. There were plenty of questions that we could have sort of delved deeper into. I think that's one of the reasons why we've really decided to make these conversations around gender-based violence a series as opposed to a one-off. But I'd like to just take the opportunity to thank once again Charlotte Ofori, Diana Peel, and Lotte Hawink Tenkate for leading us in such a rich conversation, right? This was a discussion that highlighted the importance of context and context specificity, while also acknowledging the global nature of the pervasiveness of this problem. We were able to have examples, contemporary examples of the realities of changing norms and customs, of the shortcomings, right, of the legal and criminal apparatus that exists to counter this issue. But you also gave us questions, right? Future questions that we can think about in terms of what comes next for the research, right? I'd like to thank all of our audience members for sticking with us until the very end of this conversation. Our next and final session in our Global Perspectives on Gender-Based Violence will be Sex Work: Does Legitimization Mitigate Violence? This will take place on December 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I'd like to, thank you all once again. As I mentioned, this recording will be made available on the Foundation's website, hfg.org. For those of you who have shared resources, have shared information about projects, there have even been some people who have asked to partner with you all on work that you're doing. So that is exactly what this space is for. So we're happy to get those offers coming in. We'd ask that you do get in touch with the Foundation. You can follow us on our social media platforms about upcoming events, about grant and other funding opportunities. You can follow us on Twitter at HF Guggenheim, and on Facebook and LinkedIn, we are at Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. So once again, thank you everyone, and we hope to see you at the next installment of the HFG's Knowledge Against Violence speaker series. So thank you very much.